Okay, welcome everyone here in the council chambers as well as those that are joining us from home. This is a work session of the Poquoson City Council for September 14th, and the subject of the work session and the only subject of the work session this evening is on the proposed tethering ordinance. So Randy, I guess what we'll start with, if you don't mind, you can do a brief introduction of where you got the ordinance from. Wayne, if you've got any kind of input, just to kind of go through it as far as what council should know about it, you know, what it provides for us as far as if a complaint is called in, what is the process and that sort of thing. And so without any further ado, Randy, if you'll proceed.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. Members of council, you'll recall, I believe it was May, it could have been the second April meeting, but in the spring, a number of folks from the community came forward and asked that you consider a no tethering ordinance. This has been considered and approved in some form by our neighbors on pretty much, I think, every peninsula locality at this point. I stand to be corrected, but I think that's true. During the course of the summer, Mayor, you asked, following some one-on-one conversations with council members, that the ordinance that was suggested as a model be turned into an appropriate ordinance form for the city of Poquoson. And council members, I'm fully aware that you have the ordinance in front of you, but for those watching at home, there are essentially 4 sections to this ordinance, and I'll defer to Mr. Moore on the details, but the first section is the restriction on tethering, and this pertains to times when the owner is not immediately in proximity to the dog. Permissible outside confinement is the second section. Access to water and shelter is the third. And then the last section of the ordinance is the fines for the violation section, which basically sets up a 4-tier approach. First is a violation letter, a notice of violation, and then if it is promptly taken care of, then that resolves the violation. If not, there's a series of progressive fines along with a timetable for when those would come in for failure to comply. So the first is a notice of violation, and like most other things that we deal with, our goal is not to fine people. Our goal is compliance with ordinances. So you see that reflected in the philosophy here. If you pass this, if a citizen sees with something that they consider as a potential violation of this ordinance, then they would very appropriately call animal control and report that, and the animal control officer would investigate it, as they do. In our case, Newport News handles animal control for us, and they also handle the tethering ordinance in Newport News.
Okay. Anything that you really want to point out from a legal standpoint?
It's consistent with surrounding jurisdictions.
Okay. Thank you. Council discussion. Work session.
Well, where we going to start? Around the room, Bud?
Whoever wants to. I don't really have any.
Well, I'm in favor of it. There's several reasons for it. Probably too many to sit here for hours and talk about it, but there are police studies, humane society studies. So many studies have been done on tethered dogs, the aggressive nature they take as long as they're tethered. One of them gets away, something happens to one of them, they tend to be aggressive dogs. The animals can't speak for themselves, so I think that, you know, if you're trying to speak to the animals, letting these animals have rights not to be chained up and tied up all day long is something we should certainly be considering. And our neighbors have done it for some of the same reasons I'm talking about and other reasons in general, but I just think it's something we ought to go ahead and push forward.
I disagree. For one thing, I don't think this is even enforceable. In the 38 years I've lived here, I've not seen any tethered dogs. I just don't see it's a problem here in Poquoson. would never support passing an ordinance just because all of our neighbors do it. But I just don't think it's enforceable. I mean, we're gonna have, like, meter maids go around and put a white stripe on the dog's leg, come back 60 minutes later, see if he's still there. You know, to me, it's way overkill.
Well, I have a few comments, and I am opposed to it, okay? And the reasons I'm opposed to it is I am opposed to big government. I want government to be as small as it can possibly be with as few restrictions as it can make within reason. Someone said, if you depend on the government for your liberty and your freedom, soon you'll have neither one, and I believe that to be true. And understand, I'm a dog lover, okay? I will turn on my iPad here just for a second. And that's what comes up on my iPad. Picture my little dog, loved her dearly, had to put her down about 3 months ago. And it will probably be forever getting over that. One day I might have another one. Same picture comes up on my cell phone. And wherever I went, she went. And she's lucky if her feet ever hit the ground. She lived in the house. She laid in the bed beside me and by my wife. And if I went in the garage to do a project or something, she went in the garage with me. I'd lay a blanket down, and I put her on a tether, and she'd typically lay down on her blanket while I was in the garage. And I did that because if a squirrel or a rabbit came by, she'd be off and gone like a shot. And she'd be across the street, and she may have gotten run over. And so I did that to protect my dog. Okay. Now, there are about 12,500 people who live in the city. 1% of that number would be 1,250.
100.
Oh, excuse me, 100, excuse me, 1% would be 125, fix the math, okay? 0.5% would be 62 people, okay? I believe out of that 12,500 people, you will not find 60 people in the city that would do bad things to their dog. And so what we're doing is coming up with a whole bunch of restrictions for 99.5% of the people, because less than 0.5% of the people might do something bad. And there are people who go overboard on both sides of the fence on legal issues. And like Buddy said, who's going to start the clock at 60 minutes? And I would not want to be in the garage with my little puppy, where she's still here, doing something and leave for a minute to go in the house, get a drink of water or answer a phone. And while I was in the house, have somebody drop by and see that dog on a tether unattended, and then 30 minutes later see animal control come up, and I have to defend why I left my dog unattended. And I wouldn't want to put those kind of restrictions on 99.5% of the people, because less than 0.5% of the people might do that. I think that 0.5% of the people ought to be dealt with harshly. I would not have a dog treated that way. But, I mean, some of these things, you know, like Buddy said, I think they're unenforceable. If you see somebody with a tether on a dog, and it's got to be at least 3 times the length from the dog's nose to the base of his tail, who's going to run up real quick and measure it? How in the world are you going to enforce that? How are you going to know whether the dog is 6 months old or 8 months old? I have a close friend who has 2 labs. They're much too big to live in his house, though they get there quite often, and they live in a doghouse outside. And he was concerned about them last winter because it was a very cold winter. And 3 times he hung up these plastic strip door openers to keep the wind from blowing in the doghouse. They thought it was a great toy, and he ripped all 3 of them off. He couldn't keep a strip on there to save his life, okay? Someone drives by his house and sees those things not over the door, as this ordinance requires. Next thing you know, they have a violation on them, and they're in trouble, because, not because they did something bad, but because the dog thought he found a new toy. Now, love dogs, I dearly do. Got friends who have cats that need animals. That I'm prejudiced. I believe that, you know, cats tolerate you more than love you, but a dog will love you, and you'll love them back. But I'm not going to saddle 99.5% of the people with regulations from government, because less than 0.5% of the people would do something bad.
Well, I don't think we have a tethering problem. I don't think we have a tethering problem here. This is going to address it so that we don't. In my opinion, this is so you take that There have been 3 cases that I know of in the last 2 years in Poquoson where dogs have been tethered in very inhumane conditions. I know the people personally tried to rescue them, tried to get to them. One, it was too late, the dog died. The other one, they took it away. I'm not sure where it went, who knows, because they couldn't tether it, they couldn't put it in the doors, so who knows really where that dog went. I don't think we have a tethering problem. I think this is where neighbors, or somebody's riding by and sees a dog being abused, I think your neighbors know you, bud, and wouldn't think you'd hurt your dog for anything. But I think that somebody that's got a dog that has been tethered on a regular basis, they seem to be fairly aggressive when you're walking by them, and people know who those dogs are. And Buddy, to your point, I don't think we've had any incidents either, but I don't think they had the first school shoot until they had it. You know, you never know when something's going to happen until it happens. Then it's too late when it happens. And then you go back and say, I wish we'd have done something. Well, we have an opportunity now to put something in place. So if we have a dog that's being tethered and not treated well, and the neighbors think the dog's not being treated well, that's when your law enforcement becomes involved in it. People aren't going to be getting phone calls all day long, because most of your neighbors know if you're tethering your dog for a short period of time, you're doing it for a short period of time. This is for dogs that aren't being treated fairly, are being mistreated, being abused over long periods of time, not for an hour, not for a short period of time, but that are basically living on a tether. I don't think we have a tethering problem.
It's an hour in here.
Yeah, I
That's an
saw
hour.
it. It says an hour.
So what
It says an hour.
what would you change it to?
Well, who's going to call up in an hour and 2 hours? Who's going to make the call?
Anybody who likes
if
the,
Anybody who drives
You would be surprised at the number of phone calls that,
And I'll tell you now, I loved my little puppy. I could be convicted of 1B, C, E, and I. And I loved him. We didn't have a fence in our yard. And we would put him outside on a leash, a very long leash. He could never weigh 5 pounds. He couldn't get to 5 pounds. So there's no way I could find a leash that would weigh less than 10% of his body weight. And I would leave him out there, and I would be looking at him through the kitchen window while I would cook dinner for the boys, and I would go in and out and, talk to him and everything. I did it before he was 6 months. I didn't always, sometimes I let him out there longer than an hour, but I have to agree about the over-regulation on this. I love dogs, and I'm very, very torn on this because I want to protect them as well. But I have to go back to life is not safe, and I do not want to live in a society that tries to keep me safe. That is not the government's job to keep me safe. It is my job to keep me safe. And if we expect everybody else, if I expect the government to protect me, then I'm in big trouble.
Tim?
Well, we have an abundance of animal abuse regulations. There's a whole chapter in our code book that talks about abuse of animals. Mm-hmm. And as you pointed out, Henry, you finally got somebody, or they got somebody to come and take care of the dog under our current regs. And as far as I can see, I think our current regulations cover it. And I also like animals. I made money most of my life, well, not most of my life, in the second, third, fourth grade by training calves how to lead, showing them in the fair and winning prize money. And that used to be, big time. We had chickens in the yard and bird dogs, fox dogs, everything else, forever. And it's not that I dislike animals. It's just I don't think we need the government telling me how to tie a dog.
And some people do need to be told how to tie a dog, but it doesn't need to be the government telling them that. Maybe it needs to be a nice neighbor going over and talking to them.
Then what happens after that? They take it in for a little bit, and then they bring it back outdoors after everybody's
Then
gone.
maybe another neighbor can go over.
No, unfortunately, I don't think.
But they do that regardless
But
of
it's
the
not-
law, I feel.
Yeah,
They call, I doubt they say much.
but I don't think I don't want to waste my police resources on that. I don't.
99.5% of the people do not need
And I don't
set of
wanna
laws
send
to tell
me-
them not to do something bad to their dog.
I don't want to find Bud and me because somebody doesn't want to keep talking to their neighbor.
I think it's less than that 0.5, but
Say
Oh,
again?
yeah.
I think
way
it's less than that 0.5%.
Oh, yeah,
Oh, yeah.
.005.
Yeah, you're probably talking about putting the whole list of requirements upon 99.8% of the people or 99.9, because that small percentage might do something bad. And I wouldn't have it, and we do have an existing ordinance on dogs, and if somebody really does something bad to a dog, I think it can be addressed right now with what we have.
And
I
it
think the
breaks my
genesis
heart.
of the tethering ordinances in our surrounding areas grew out of the concerns about dog fighting, finding pit bulls chained to a axle buried in the ground on a 6-foot chain, and that, of course, is abuse. And hopefully, we've never had that or ever would have that in Poquoson. But I think that, the complete ordinance is an overkill for a problem that is minuscule, as Bud is saying. It's a very small percentage, and hopefully we'll never have that kind of situation in town. And there are other ways to deal with it if it is a problem, if it is a real, as Carrie was saying. We have ordinances that address abuse of animals, and that should be sufficient.
I'm just gonna, and I'll stop after this. I happen to be at a house that gets phone calls continually where animals are being abused, continually. I see it all the time. I'm not sure if it's 0.5% or 0.2%, but it happens. And if we don't think it happens in our community, we're being blind to that. All the laws on the books, everything we have in place, somebody complains that people bring the dog inside while the problem goes away. Then the dog's back outside. And like I said, this is
That's
not
gonna
happening
happen
a
here
lot.
too, right?
It is, until you start really enforcing what we have here.
So are you drawing the line at you want the ordinance on the books, or do you want us to drive around and enforce it?
I want the ordinance on the books. And again, like I said, this is not where I deem we have a giant problem, but if we think there's not something, if we think we don't have these kind of things happen in our communities, I know it's not dog fighting, but there are people that just get an animal, it's great, it's novelty, it's a puppy, they get it, then the dog grows up, it's not a puppy anymore, and it's not fun anymore, they put it on a chain outside, and they let it go. And if you don't think that happens, we're blind to that. I get the phone, like I said, this phone rings on a fairly regular basis. It hasn't rang in a while on dogs, but on animal cruelty things that are happening here. And so if you don't think that happens, I have a hard time.
Well, Henry, I don't think anybody here is arguing with you, and I think that the bottom line is we feel your passion, and I think we kind of knew where council was overall on this. It is hard, it is very difficult, and the people will not like, in the long run, over-regulation. We see it, and what I'm hearing council say is that the existing laws on the books, and probably running the metrics of how many times the Humane Society has been called down here, if you ran those numbers, would it be worth this level of regulation? That's why I asked you the question. Do you want us to drive around and enforce it? Because as you know, we do not enforce we basically leave it complaint-based, okay? And one of the hardest things that we do as a city or any government does is basically govern based on neighbor issues. We've seen it. I'll just go back to the chicken ordinance that we saw about a year and a half ago. And we saw neighbor on neighbor about the ordinance to have chickens in your yard or whatever. Popular right now, may not always be popular, things will change. So I hear what you're saying. I'm looking for where we think, besides giving somebody the ability to call on their neighbor, we're not going to enforce it. I don't think our neighbors really enforce it. So what is it that we're doing? If you can clarify that, then I think then maybe you can get some following. If we're just putting it on the books to put it on the books, then I think what I'm hearing council say is, and we've been pretty famous for this, sometimes including you, sometimes not including you, on saying that regulation just for the sake of regulation is not the way we want to govern.
Well, I think everybody knows where I stand on government. But I'm probably more passionate about animals than I am for my dislike of our government, knowing they can't speak for themselves. Somebody has to be the voice for these creatures, because they can't speak for themselves. They can't call somebody, they can't tell somebody they're hurting.
But would you really, Henry, punish me for having done that to my puppy?
If I thought your dog was being abused, I'd pick up the phone in 2
But
seconds,
if he-
or
but I
I'd come
don't
to your
think he
door.
was being abused, and I was committing.
Then I wouldn't think your neighbors would
I
call.
had him out there.
I wouldn't think your neighbors would call then.
How
Well-
about this? I have a neighbor that had 13 dogs. She passed away and I loved her dearly. Neighbor 2 doors over did not get along very well with her because there were 13 dogs. They're loud. That neighbor would have called on the first neighbor who did some of these things.
Well, then she probably should have.
Those dogs were loved. They were the
If
babies.
they're
They
sitting
were
out, are they
fully
sitting
taken
outside
care of.
tethered all day long?
No, they weren't tethered. But they didn't have the fence thing. They were breaking some of the other
I've
the
seen,
enclosure
I
stuff.
think we've all seen animals abused.
It's about
And that-
neighbors not
the-
getting along
The
more.
tethering or in a pen, what difference does it make besides maybe what you said about training them to fight as pit bulls or whatever? I've seen dogs die in their pens. Okay, we have a law that basically says you
Treat your
can't do
animals nice.
that. So what is it that this is bringing that doesn't? That's what I'm
Yes.
thinking that council wants to basically make a judgment on, is what is it
There are
doing for us
state
that we can't
laws.
do today?
About giving your animal adequate and appropriate care. And I don't think that this brings anything more other than pettiness almost. I mean, I don't, that's the wrong word, but
There's a whole lot of detail in here that within common sense you can't really enforce. And things that you wouldn't think people would call on, maybe they wouldn't, but there are people who would. And to have someone who is innocent of wrongdoing have to prove that they're innocent because somebody rode by and they didn't see you there. And it's not the intent, it's what's written here.
right. It's
what's written
feel-good
here.
legislation is what I'm reading.
I got you.
That's
So let me ask this question, and I'm just trying to keep us talking for just a minute to see if there's any future in this. Are there changes to this that we could somehow come to a consensus of that wouldn't be bad? And if that answer is no, I'm willing to listen to that, but I think we owe it to ourselves to ask.
Well, I think it comes down to the same thing. I don't care how you change it. If you pass a non-tethering law, how are you going to enforce it? To me, it's tantamount to legislating morality. It never has worked and it never will work. If somebody is intent on abusing an animal, they're going to do it, whether we pass this ordinance or not. And this, to me, is a nuisance ordinance.
I'm perfectly satisfied with the existing ordinances and think that it handles the situation.
Okay?
My heart is just broken thinking about the whole thing.
Well, you know, I showed you a picture of my dog, and if I open up my cell phone, you'll see the same picture.
All right, so I'm hearing that basically the answer is there's really, it basically would gut the ordinance and it wouldn't, that's kind of what I'm hearing, but am I wrong?
People are going to do wrong whether we pass the law or not.
Okay.
The ones who are going to do it.
All right,
Yeah, From a
so,
legal standpoint, I don't see,
okay,
yeah.
all right, so, anything else in the work session? Okay, and we'll move forward and close out the work session, and I'll move forward to the regular session. It should be, what time is it right now? 10 minutes?
Cry.